Hey everyone, welcome back. Peter and I are excited to announce that our next project is now available. We think it's the future of filmmaking, and it has to do with crypto. So check it out. The link's in the description. It's an NFT-based filmmaking experience. If you're not sure what crypto is and maybe want to learn more about it, well, this is the perfect podcast to figure that out. We'll be talking more about that shortly, but check out the link below. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm JP. My brother Peter is again not able to join us. He's out learning how to serve our country a little bit better, but we have a wonderful guest that I can't wait to introduce to you. I met him at the Sam Houston State University, just north of Houston, and we had a great time because he was a history professor that was constantly having our class in stitches. I still remember him describing the complete ineptitude of Tsarist Russia just prior to the Bolshevik Revolution in the 20th century class. Like, they just couldn't hack it. They went to England to try to steal all of England's secrets, and they couldn't hack it. This is a very politically incorrect sort of look at history, which I super welcomed and loved. But besides knowing that he's a professor of history at Sam Houston, or former professor of history at Sam Houston State University, he's also the Richard S. Strong Scholar at the Laffer Center, and is the author of 5 books in the tradition of supply-side economics. He's an economic historian, which is why we have him on board here to tell us a little bit more about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and all that stuff that we're probably hearing about that we should probably know more about. He also holds a PhD in history from Harvard. So, Professor Brian Domitrovic, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's really good to be here, James. Thanks for having me.
It is really my pleasure to be able to be talking to you again. I hear that you are now you're calling in from Nashville, Tennessee.
That's right. Here I am at one of the most booming cities in the United States. My moving company told me the other day that they are bringing 100 people in a day to Nashville. So it's a zero income tax state like Texas and Florida and 6 others. And that's where all the capital is going in this country.
Yep, that's right. And there's good reasons for that. Maybe you can kind of tell us a little bit more about why that is so important later on. But I want to focus a little bit on cryptocurrency. Particularly how that relates to the American dream. And obviously, we hear of all the cryptocurrencies, we hear more about Bitcoin. And so maybe we can kind of dive into where we're seeing the trajectory for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general. Before we dive into particulars, though, I wanted to give a brief introduction for what cryptocurrency is. And the way I understand it, and this is kind of cryptocurrency for dummies, because I'm a bit of a dummy, I think, and this, at least in this field. And I see it as an Excel spreadsheet of sorts that is decentralized, that everyone has access to seeing it. And that's the type of technology that we call the blockchain. It's a decentralized ledger of different transactions that people are constantly building upon, and yet it's immutable. It cannot be changed by the history of the transactions cannot be changed without everyone seeing that someone's trying to change it, because it's all able to be organized. And upon that blockchain is built a currency that people say, okay, this has value. This string of code on this blockchain that everyone can see has a value, and they assess a value of X amount to it. And there are different blockchains, just as there are different cryptocurrencies. The one that's most popular, or the most known, is something called Bitcoin. It's been around the longest. It was the first into the game. And there's only X amount of Bitcoin on that blockchain. If someone would try to add it or maybe flood the market with it, everyone would see it and say, hey, hang on, that's not, it's sort of a self-policing because of all these eyes that are upon it. Does that kind of make sense as far as please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, sure. Oh, that's very good, James. That's what it is. I would add that over the last many years, decades, we've obviously had a tremendous revolution in computer science. I mean, everybody knows that, dating back to even the 1940s with the first big vacuum machines that tried to do mass calculations. and then into the 50s and 60s with rocket guidance by computer, and then the rise of the personal computer in the 1970s and 1980s, and then the internet in the 1990s with all the kind of software innovating behind all the new hardware. So we're very familiar. It's been our experience now for 2.5 generations that there's a revolution in computer science. Well, part of the specific revolution in the 1990s involved computer science looking into immutable ledgers. And so the first Bitcoin arose via a white paper, a famous kind of publication that was posted on the internet in November 2008 by a pseudonym, a guy named Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't know who that is. Some people say it was Hal Finney, the great Caltech professor. If I had to bet, it was probably him, but I have no idea who it was. But he made it very clear, the white paper did, or Satoshi did, that this is building on the computer science of the last 15 years, in which we can make immutable ledgers. And once you can do that, then each one of those things that is immutable can count as a token of currency with an absolute amount, and with a way of getting new ones that are also of the same nature, and that can be tradable such that if you share it with somebody, you don't keep it like you do with a message or a picture on your iPhone, but you actually give it to that other person when you share it from your phone or something like that. So yeah, I mean, that's in general what Bitcoin is, and we should understand it in the long revolution of computer science.
Okay. And then maybe we can also understand it a little bit better when we contrast it to something like the US dollar, which another name for that is fiat currency. You know, every country generally has its own fiat. We have the dollar. How is something like Bitcoin, can you compare it and contrast it to something like the US dollar, how it's different, how it changes?
Yeah, I actually think Bitcoin is very similar to the US dollar. Classically understood, traditionally understood. It's not similar to the modern dollar, the dollar of, say, the last 50 or 75 years, but it's very similar to the US dollar of the first circa 150 years of American history. I mean, the United States now produces dollars, these things that say Federal Reserve notes. That is a new development in American history. Generally, in American history, the United States government did not produce dollars. They struck a few coins, but in terms of paper currency, the United States did not, in general, produce dollars. They left it to the private sector. The private sector produced dollars. If you look on the internet, eBay, you want to buy an old US dollar from whenever, the 1880s or the 1840s, you'll see that they're all issued by private banks, by private institutions, and they're calling themselves the US dollar. You won't find any currency struck by the Treasury. So that private currency was always what we had, and all the US did was define what a dollar was. They just said, well, if you want to make dollars, you can, if you wish, take advantage of our definition of the dollar, and that is a dollar is a little less than 1/20th of an ounce of gold. If you wish to avail yourself of that definition, and they did, and we had the Industrial Revolution under that monetary system.
So that's what we mean when we say the gold standard, no?
That is what it's a little broader than that, because this wasn't just a gold standard. The United States said, and again, this was voluntary. I mean, if you want to avail yourself of this system, we're offering one. There's a 16-to-1 ratio of gold to silver. So if we say gold is 1/20th of an ounce, a dollar is 1/20th of an ounce of gold, then it would be a 16th of that would be $1 in silver. That we're simply offering definitions. So we're offering a little less than an ounce of silver as a dollar, as a definition. We're not doing anything about that. Yes, we will strike some coins if you bring some of these precious metals to us, but we're not printing any currency. You can do that if you want to. And people did. And people said, well, thank you, government. We'll take that definition for the dollar, and here we'll print this currency that says US dollar. And people will know, well, yeah, if they come to us, then they can get a 20th of an ounce of gold. And in that, Bitcoin is very similar, because anyone, US government could say if it wanted to, we define the dollar as, say, 1/60,000th of a Bitcoin. I actually believe that will happen in the fairly near future, probably in 20 years, if not within 20 years, I would say. Something like the major governments of the world, the major political economic institutions of the world will be saying something like our currency is X amount of Bitcoin.
That's a bold statement right there.
Yeah, I know, but something's happening in the 21st century. So, it's time for us to imagine what it might be.
I like that. I like that because then it allows us to perhaps prepare.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe looking back a little bit, what happened? So if that was the system, was there an inherent weakness within the system? Like this is the gold, like this dollar is worth 1/20th or whatever you said of a gold bar or 2 ounces of gold. Why did we go away from it? Was there a weakness that people were perceiving?
So this had a very long history. So this was the monetary system of the United States and the colonies before it, all the way arguably until 1971, with the diminishing, with attenuation from 1933 on, arguably from the Civil War on. Right, so now we don't have this, we just have fiat money, but that really only began in 1971 when the United States officially went off the gold standard. It was in the 1930s that the United States really kind of pushed aside all other bank currency in favor of US Federal Reserve notes. But there wasn't any material problem with this system in that, as I say, we had the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the economic growth rates of the United States from, say, 1789 to 1913, the founding of the Fed, 4 or 5% per year. Probably double, roughly, maybe 175% of what we've had since then. So it's hard to say there was any kind of real problem with it. You can point to, again, panics and this kind of stuff. The Great Depression blows that out of the water. So does stagflation in the 1970s, the Great Recession. So whatever panics there may have been, and we can go over specific examples if you want to, but the monetary system of the ages in which the United States just defined the dollar and then private entities took advantage of it as they wished, and all currency production was private for the Great Main, gave us the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah,
so that's the greatest thing in economic history.
Yeah, absolutely. And my ears perked up when you said 1930. So you just correct me if I misheard. You said in 1930 we really started to come off of this system.
Well, it was attenuated in various ways. It it started in the Civil War. You never let a crisis go to waste. It's amazing that an incredible peacetime development was born of warfare. So during the Civil War, so once the war started in 1861, private currency issuers realized that they could no longer issue currency because taxes were up and there was war. So nobody was going to be demanding currency for real purposes, and currency was going to inflate in value. There was 100% inflation during the Civil War. So banks suspended in late 1861. Private banks suspended their issuance of currency because the conditions of the war were just crazy. So the United States Congress took advantage of that in a very fateful move, a series of moves through 1864, saying that from now on, if you want to issue currency in the United States and not face a tax, so the United States started taxing private currency. Okay, you want to know why you got away with it? They started taxing private currency. And they'll try to tax Bitcoin, don't worry, they really are to capital gains right now. So they put a tax on private currency. Yeah, they put a tax on private currency, and then they said, if you don't want the tax, then you have to be one of our 1,000 banks that we approve of, and you issue a national currency, then you have to have a certain minimum of federal bonds in your bank in order to have the right to issue that tax-free currency. So it was the beginning of a takeover. Was there any reason for that? I mean, you can argue about the Civil War, wartime measures. Who knows in 1864? I don't know how Mr. Lincoln's war, how he wants to run it. It's his business. But the question is, why did we stick with this, for forever? And I don't have a good answer to that question, because eventually that morphed into, we're just going to have a Federal Reserve notes, and we're not even going to have these 1,000 private banks with federal bonds. And then by the 1930s, the United States had squeezed out all of that residual national bank currency, and it was just the Federal Reserve is issuing notes. And that's why we've had the price index has lost 96% under that regime, compared to price stability and 5% growth. in the 19th century.
This is kind of an aside, but I find it fascinating to think that a system that was working prior to a war happened, a terrible war, tragedy, and so maybe they are justified to change up a working system for a brief period of time. But it does seem, from a historical perspective, that once a government takes power for X reason, they have a very difficult time letting it go.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I become, I put on my public choice hat. I mean, I understand in a very narrow kind of animalistic fashion, and this is not a compliment, why governments want to do this kind of thing. Governments see a threat in the private sector in a kind of strictly Darwinian level. The private sector is a predator of governments. I mean, if private sectors really work, then there's no reason for governments. I mean, the Constitution even speaks of letters of marque. You could even have an independent foreign policy, inclusive of militaries, without the government, if you have a really well-run private sector. So, in a certain way, there's a competition between the private sector, and it's going to be it's a zero-sum game. If the private sector really succeeds, government must die. So. Wow. If you put it in those kind of stark Darwinian terms, you see that there's a narrow self-interest that government can have if it's of low character to try to stop what the private sector's doing in terms of its success.
Not to jump too much in the future, but we saw last year, and probably continuing on this year, the government really having a say in pretty much destroying the ability of the private sector to actually function. What is that? What do you make of that sort of?
Yeah, James, I'm not, I'm not fibbing when I'm putting forward this view. I think government is kind of political theoretical, has a kind of parasitic view towards its host, which is the private sector. It doesn't necessarily want to kill the host, like in a good parasite. It wants to kind of keep it alive in some, range of minimum so that it can keep feeding off it. And if it doesn't, if it grows too quickly and squashes the parasite, well, that's it for the parasite. So there's this kind of weird middling range that government is always trying to kind of keep the private sector in. And the question is, how does the private sector fight back? And I think we're now finding out through Bitcoin.
Bitcoin is the great equalizer.
Or the great unequalizer.
Okay. This is exciting. I want to put this into a movie. I like that. Okay. I want to get back a little bit to what we spoke about earlier with the American dream. Can you help me define what that is and then show how that is influenced maybe by this new tool that's at our disposal?
Sure. American dream, a term coined by a Pulitzer Prize winning historian in 1931. When we were in a very bad shape economically, unemployment was soaring and growth was crashing. Is the kind of national ethos of the United States, and that's a term I actually get from Wikipedia. The Wikipedia entry, I encourage your readers to look at it. It's very good on the American dream, actually. This national ethos that each generation can do better, and that there is a kind of a common purpose in this country that everyone should do very well. There's a kind of common belief in that everyone is acting on the understanding that we all should do really well, that everyone can kind of live like kings in a certain way. And that's the kind of American response to its original action of overthrowing a monarchy. It's that, we're going to kind of bring kind of the rich life of living like a king to everyone. And the history of American prosperity does not fall terribly short of that remarkable aspirational goal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unheard of in history is this many people to be this prosperous. For me to be sitting here in an air-conditioned room, in my own home, like I'm literally living like a king of old. And it's fascinating. So that's the idea.
James, I mean, I lived in Houston, as you know. I lived there for 16 years. I'm just stunned at things like the housing stock of Houston. The working class lives in homes with wooden ceilings, granite everywhere, 4 or 5 bedroom homes. This is working class, everyone, and they don't pay anything for this stuff. 6 to 8 million people are doing this. So yeah, that's the American dream, and it's not to be sneezed at, and it's a very important substrate of what goes on in the American economy. And I think the 21st century is going to testify to that great base that is the American economy, which is we all must do very well.
But tell me, there is a lot of people saying that, the age of American exceptionalism is over, the American dream has ended. What would you respond to someone that says that? Because I hear it all the time.
Yeah, well, I don't know about American exceptionalism. I mean, this is, I don't know necessarily how exceptional the United States is. You look countries around the world, and Hong Kong did this great, maybe not anymore. China was thinking about doing it for a long time. I think their leadership is starting to realize exactly what I talked about earlier. Hey, wait a minute, private sector succeeds, government has a problem. So, I mean, there are plenty, Chile, there are plenty of examples, West Europe for a long time. I think Eastern Europe is really moving on this score, tremendous rates of growth in places like Poland and Hungary. So I think the Middle East has a very admirable currency tradition. The Islamic appreciation for classical monetary systems, I think could end up saving the world in a certain way.
Really? Can you expound on that a little bit? I'm sorry, that's a big statement. Saving the world?
Well, I mean, fiat money is not saving the world. I know that. So it's going to be something else. Not the establishmentarian tradition in the Western world. Not that. That's clear as day. So we can eliminate that as what is going to possibly save the world. Islam has, for centuries, maintained sound monetary traditions. Kind of their prohibitions on usury, so to speak, which come from exactly the same taproot as those of Christianity.
Right.
What T.S. Eliot said, he has his little petty savings account, and he says, I find myself a small usurer in a world of mega usurers, or something like that. That's when the monetary system was collapsing in the 20s, away from the gold standard. So yeah, I mean, the Gulf states and all the Islamic intellectual tradition, they're all for like real money. And part of the usury tradition is when you lend money to somebody, if you charge them a rate of interest, it's understood that maybe you might have a stake in the business, and it's more like a dividend, and it's a very kind of communitarian vision. And yeah, I mean that's the monetary system that we used to have pre-fiat money. So American exceptionalism, I think we don't necessarily need that language, although we should be very careful about not ceding the obligations of American leadership as well.
Okay. Well, I have a question on that, but I just have to ask, save the world from what exactly?
Well, I always bring up the golf metaphor, right? I mean, I guess I've read too much John Updike, but there's this classic in golf when you're playing with your partners, when you birdie a hole, the next hole you get a triple bogey. And the adage your partners always say is, well, you can't stand prosperity, can you? As soon as you get a little prosperity, you just have to go muck it up. There's something in the consciousness. Are you afraid of success, man? As Mr. Potter says to Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life. There is something to that in the human psyche. That you experience some prosperity and it's just a little too much for you. I don't know why exactly, a little bit. So you can flush prosperity down the toilet. I mean, you can do that. So I just would caution the world, the United States, don't do that.
I have to push you a little bit more. So you're just to kind of fill in the blanks a little bit of what you're saying is, so you think Islam, with its respect for actual currency, can save the world from the West falling into a decadence and decay because we've become too prosperous, and that's going to create a sort of monster?
Well, no, I might. It's interesting. I might. These are large kind of. I wrote a book recently on Arthur Laffer's early career, and I got into kind of Hegelian interpretations of history. So this is kind of getting in terms of kind of the global self-consciousness and that kind of thing, which is a little bit, maybe a little bit Hegelian. But I think it's also consistent with kind of classical interpretations of history. I'm a historian, intellectual historian, after all. This is where all this comes from.
Yes.
I mean, I think the West has its fiat money in its monetary establishment and its kind of Keynesian economic officialdom because it's so prosperous. So it can afford to have this stuff that's wrong. It can afford it. You can afford a lot of things when you're rich. Other places in the world, even including Islam, they're not as rich. A lot of these places, some of them obviously have boomed because of oil money, but that's because of the West. They're more careful in a certain way about not kind of getting it wrong. They have a stronger incentive. When Aristotle wrote about this, when you become very prosperous, you have to kind of develop a parsimony. You can just waste your resources and indulge all this stuff because you're well off. And people of really high character figure out how to handle that, to indulge where they should, and then to be parsimonious where they should. Right. And that's really tight character. I mean, that's phenomenal character. Well, okay, we don't quite have that. We got rich and then we bought, we blew our money on having a Keynesian economic establishment that's like wrong about everything. Okay, we can get away with that for a while because we're so rich, but eventually if we really let it have power, it's gonna really drag us down. And so I think the kind of collective consciousness of the body politic has risen up to kind of pull down that Keynesian establishment through things like Bitcoin.
Can you, I see a little bit what you're saying now, but you said another term that I think is important because it's thrown around so much, Keynesian economics. Yeah. Can you say what that is a little bit more and then why we believe so much in it?
Yeah, sure. It's just after John Maynard Keynes, Keynes, the British economist who's flourished big works in the 20s and the 30s. And he really influenced macroeconomics in the United States and globally after World War II, after the Great Depression. And he argued that in general, economies cannot reach their full potential unless there's government intervention, that they kind of clear transactions kind of below optimality. And that's particularly the case. I just wrote about this in the book, The Emergence of Arthur Laffer. What he argued is that when you have an industrial revolution that happened, a long time in the past, like in the 1750s in Britain or the 19th century in the United States, your rich people now are people with inherited money. And people with inherited money don't have like animal spirits. They don't want to go out there and do things. And so all your capital is kind of tied up with these people who just stuff their money in the bonds or something. And it's not active. And so the economy will start to clear at levels well below kind of full employment and its potential. And so that's when government has to step in, take the money from the settled rich and apply it in good investment projects. And that mode of thinking predominated easily for 40 years after the World War II. And it's still a very, very important paradigm today in macroeconomics. And it's I disagree kind of roundly with it.
Yeah, I mean, is the reason why it's so accepted, is it just because you kind of said a sort of, you put down the rich a little bit with that definition. Well, the rich are not going to give anything to the economy. That's why we have to kind of get around the rich in order, the landed money, the old money, in order to make stuff happen. Do people believe it because there's a sort of distrust of the rich in general?
Well, there was a Great Depression. So, I mean, the first prerequisite for the wildfire of Keynesianism was the Great Depression. And the Keynesianism provided at once an explanation of this event. So people, when the terrible event was occurring, and there was so much kind of idleness because of the unemployment and such, the topic, some guru who was just giving you the knowledge of why this happened had there's particular receptivity to that. And then on top of that, it provided a kind of a prescription for policy in the future, and it created a profession. It created the profession of macroeconomics. It didn't exist before then. And once you have a profession that has a narrow self-interest, then the profession, and I wrote about this in the book, and this book I just published, The Emergence of Arthur Laffer, it's about the economic debates of the 1960s and 70s, macroeconomics. Once you have a profession that stakes itself on this, well, then it has to keep arguing that if it has narrow self-interest, because if it says, no, we're all wrong, well, then they just have to quit their jobs. So, you had a new profession in the 50s and 60s that said the economy cannot clear without economists' advice and policy, without our advice. So once you got that, they're going to fight to stay relevant.
And also, it strikes me that if we're looking at the private sector and then the government as sort of the parasite and host, the Keynesian economics gives the parasite a sort of greater ability to suck from the private sector. It seems like there's a real the government would be propelled to want to accept this and push this idea.
Yeah, you're right. This macroeconomics grew up as an adjunct to government because government needs the economy in a certain way to fail. And then macroeconomics kind of rose up as a kind of consultant in that management of the host. Now, I should point out that Keynes's diagnosis of the cause of the Great Depression was wholly fallacious, in every sense. So there was a lot of dishonesty that accompanied these transitions at every turn. I mean, government caused the Great Depression in its entirety. There was no private participation, no private elements to the causes of the Great Depression. So the whole thing was snake bit from the beginning. I don't necessarily blame Keynes as much, even though he really was kind of a weirdo in terms of how he presented his ideas. But what I blame is kind of the willingness of masses, really, of these kind of economic professionals to go with this interpretation.
Interesting. I think we could do a whole hour on just that topic, the Great Depression, right there, because I'm very fascinated by that. But I know we're running short, and running long, and I wanted to get back to. Thank you for correcting me earlier when I conflated the two terms, American exceptionalism and the American dream. And you were able to correct me, and I appreciate that. But dive in a little bit more about, okay, where do you see our future in regards to the American dream, and how does Bitcoin play a part in that?
Well, I think Bitcoin is a phenomenal herald that the United States is not giving up on the American dream. It's going down. It's more than going down fighting on the American dream. It's going to recapture the mantle of the American dream in the 21st century. So Bitcoin is obviously a completely alternative currency system to the fiat system. But more than that, it remarkably is patterned off of gold and the way gold behaves, and the way gold can function in the monetary system. In fact, if you look at you superimpose the graphs of the price history of gold after the U.S. went off the gold standard against the appreciation of Bitcoin, it's amazing how similar the graphs are. It's clear from the white paper and forward that Bitcoin aspires to have gold-like characteristics as a fixed supply. It's increasingly difficult to get at that supply, and so forth. And I think there's an understanding on the part of the originators of Bitcoin that gold was finally co-opted by governments. So gold is the monetary system of the ages, at least 5,000 years. It's been a monetary base of the world. And it was only beginning in the 1930s with the gold confiscation in the United States, the creation of Fort Knox and so forth, that governments finally got wise and said the way we can break there being an outside definition of the currency is to own all the base currencies. So today, something like 75% of world gold is held by governments. So gold has kind of been ruined in a way because governments got wise to it and then took it all, or the lion's share of it. And so Bitcoin showed up with all these gold-like characteristics, and it was crucial, very crucial in Bitcoin's early years, for the first, let's say, 8-9 years of its existence, that it be completely mocked as a loser, because that's how you distract attention away from it. How did they finally kill gold? They killed gold by getting it all. Well, Bitcoin had within its cleverness a strategy to deal with that, which is no one's going to take us seriously. We're a bunch of losers in our basement. We can't spell hodl instead of hold. We're cranks, like those who advocate the gold standard are cranks. We're crackpots. We're losers. Okay, then you don't get any attention as you produce more and more of it and collect more and more and more and more of it. Well, that first huge price spike in 2017, I mean, I know it went to 1,000 in like 2013, but when it went to 20,000, 15,000 in 2017, people were like, ooh, this could be for real. And I think that's the moment when governments started to realize we have to start buying this stuff. So I'm sure that's going on right now. And I think every time there's a decline in Bitcoin, I always notice that some government is trying to trash it. Like the Chinese, for example. They keep saying, well, we're never gonna accept Bitcoin. And then Bitcoin goes down for a little bit. And you start to see the cause and effect. Well, maybe they're just trying to lower the price so they can buy it up. Because now with crypto's market cap, over 2 trillion, it's getting a little late to buy it up. I mean, what are say China's foreign reserves? Do they really want to put them all in Bitcoin, or half of them in Bitcoin? Do they maybe a couple trillion right now? They're going to buy all the Bitcoin in the world.
And China's got more than one fish to fry for their money.
Yeah, I know. So, the time to buy all the Bitcoin was when it was, $400, not when it's 60,000. So crucial to Bitcoin's success was its very inherent cleverness in being loserdom. And that's the way the Revenge of the Nerds worked in the tech revolution too. These were all jokers and like, oh, wait a minute, they're completely transforming our lives and will never stop doing so. So Bitcoin is following that pattern.
But how does that relate to you and I, to just a normal Joe like me? How does that relate?
Yeah, I think it's all good. Now, number one, I should point out that Bitcoin has now proven to be the greatest investment opportunity of all time, the greatest democratic investment opportunity of all time. I think when I talked to you before, James, we mentioned this. Anyone could buy it, like Coinbase or whatever, existed when 2012 or something. So literally anyone could buy it then when it was like, I don't know, $50, $20. And even if you wanted to really get into it before then, before there were crypto exchanges, you could mine it, for 8 cents. So you could buy, thousands of Bitcoin for nothing, or get it for nothing. And there was you didn't have to be an accredited investor, to get, if you want to get a real good venture capital opportunity today, you have to have $5 million and a signature from the bank saying you're an accredited investor. And, that's where, otherwise you have to wait for the IPO. There's none of that with Bitcoin. You just get it if you were anybody. And there were any number of people who were anybody's, and they have it. And now they're like, whoa, I have $50 million. There's a lot of those kind of people, and but they're jokers, and that's part of the soft power of Bitcoin that's absolutely essential. So number one, it's made it's involved in the American dream, and this is incredible democratic investment opportunity. But I also think it's going to reassert the classical currency system of this country, that currency system that presided over the American dream and the 5% growth. So it's going to be great for all of us because we'll live in an America with the American dream reestablished again.
So you see it as the bedrock for reestablishing the economic power of this country.
Yeah, not just the power. I think of it more in terms of what the old Woolstead somebody called soft power, not hard power. Well, it's just the economy doing great. And I think hard power is opposed to Bitcoin. We're going to make it illegal. We're going to bring our guns and laws to say it's illegal. And Bitcoin's like, we don't have any laws. We don't good. We just it's just a cult. Everyone loves it. It's just all love. So, and I think soft power always wins. If it's mass soft power always beats, hard power.
Right. I feel like I used a term without properly defining it. I don't look at power, and when I say that, I don't see it in its negative light. I don't see it as domination. Just like, yeah, it works. It helps everyone here. It's a sort of bringing everybody up.
Yeah, and people love it. There's also an emotional bond, a cult-like bond. We love this. That's why gold bugs, God-centered people are cranks. Cranks love their stuff. Now, you may say they're idiotic and all that stuff, but they have this visceral, kind of beyond emotional attraction. And you have that with Bitcoin en masse. That's like all the owners. And how many are there? There are hundreds of thousands, millions, I don't know. And they all love it. Where's that for the fiat dollar? I mean, who loves the fiat dollar? Like nobody. I mean, a couple, the 300 economists at the Fed, that's it. You're not going to win that fight. I mean, if there's mass love, that's going to win. That's going to beat hard power. Yeah,
nobody loves the government like people in crypto love Bitcoin or altcoins.
Yeah, right. So therefore that will win.
That's exciting to me. That's exciting. But just to kind of throw like a doubt in there, what about, we're seeing right now, I've never experienced, I mean, I haven't been around that long, but I've studied history quite a bit in America, and and obviously not as much as you, but so maybe you can help me. I was shocked last year when the government could say, churches, shut your doors, and the churches all shut their doors. Like that sort of power was, it was shocking to me to see something like that happen. And you could say, there was exceptions to the rule that there's a pandemic going on, but still that's a lot of power. And I have a fear right now in for example, a lot of mandates being happening, and the throwing into question being able to work your job or things like that without complying to mandates or things like that. There just seems to be a lot of domination from the government happening. Couldn't that makes me fear for this sort of free market enterprise that Bitcoin is, with that sort of totalitarianism coming from our government? Does that bring any doubts to you?
No, and I totally appreciate that, James. Of course, all this draconian stuff. Just to be impolite, I'm sure. I consider that horrific Sarah Everard murder in England to be a kind of a classic expression of the government's response to the COVID crisis. Here's a policeman who accosted this woman on the grounds that she wasn't wearing a mask, and his only intentions were to ravish her and murder her. So I think that's the kind of reductio ad absurdum of the essence of the government's response in certain ways to the COVID crisis. I mean, government does not like the private sector, ultimately, if the private sector is really going to succeed. And it wants to humiliate it and destroy it if it's going to get that uppity. Okay, so you have your sledgehammers. All right, great. I just don't see sledgehammers winning in the long term against organized soft power, against mass, spontaneous, organic soft power. And that's what we're seeing in Bitcoin. So I'd like to see how I know what they're going to do. They're going to put a capital gains. They have a capital gains tax on it. They're going to try to limit it, and regulate it, and all that stuff. And I'm telling you, what they're going to try to do is knock the price down and then buy it all up. So the question is when they take all these moves to limit it and outlaw it and so forth, if the price goes down, because then we'll know if the price goes down, then what they did that so they could buy it, because the only way they can really nail it is by buying it. But of course, the crypto universe has a response to that. Well, we can manufacture cryptos ad nauseum. There's no limit. If you take all the Bitcoin, we can just start a new Bitcoin. And what are you going to do?
Next man up.
Yeah, it's right. Next man up. And so that's what I'm saying. There's this kind of Jungian collective consciousness on the part of kind of the American dream that has already figured out implicitly and unconsciously all these potential challenges. And I don't think government's up to the challenge.
This is exciting. You're giving me a lot of as they would say in the crypto world, hopium. How do they say it? I don't know.
Yeah, they have all these funny, the hodl and the such wow, and it doesn't end. Yeah, the memes.
Yeah, it's an incredibly powerful community, and that's really what I always come back to with what we need to have in order to actually grow our education, our economy, or anything, you name it, as a human connection. It needs to be some sort of community, a gathering of people coming together. And that's what I see when I look at cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's really neat. I mean, I've commented, maybe I mentioned to you before, James, I don't know, my favorite piece of writing on Bitcoin is that of Jeffrey Tucker, the great economist at the American Institute for Economic Research. And he wrote an article a year or two ago, great article, I forget the name of it, about his experience going to Bitcoin conventions over the last 10 years. And he said at first, and this must have been 2013, I guess, when it briefly went to 1,000, that everyone was at these conventions in Lamborghinis and sports cars because, they had made a killing. I bought Bitcoin at $8 and now it's 1,000. I sold it. I gave a Lamborghini. And that was the look of the early Bitcoin conventions. And then he went on, and then I noticed over the next few years, as Bitcoin really went up, like through 2017, that everyone was driving beaters. I mean, there's no more Lamborghinis, and they're wearing used clothes, and I realized they were putting all of their money into Bitcoin. They were just getting rid of their consumption. And he says, and just then, for the first time, I saw with my own eyes what life used to be like in this country. Back in the 19th century, when money was hard, when you really were sure that if you saved money, it was really saving something, that's what people did with their money. They saved it. And I got a glimpse of what the basis of what life was like when we were building the base of the American dream back then. I saw it again with my own eyes. So, and he just said it's this remarkable transformation of kind of superficiality into virtue. And he just said it was something to behold. And I think it still remains my favorite thing that's ever been said about Bitcoin.
I'll have to look for that article. Thank you. That's incredibly hopeful right there, because we need virtue. That's what solves crises, human virtue. And that's exciting. Huh. Yep. Well, speaking of virtue, Dr. Domitrovic, I want to thank you because I always go back to the classes that I was able to enjoy back at Sam Houston State that you taught me. So many things. Sometimes they're funny things like making fun of Tsarist Russia, or sometimes they're just thinking back on the little point of history and how that influences what's happening now. And I still often talk to my wife about this sort of thing that happened that you brought up in your class or one of your classes back over 10 years ago now. So I really appreciate it. I think that it's a rare thing to have a professor that's able to influence you the way you've influenced me, and I'm very grateful to you.
Thanks, James. I'm really happy to hear that. And history is so important, and we did it together, you and I. And I think even this little phenomenon we're talking about here, Bitcoin, kind of shows you kind of how we're reaching back into history and making it our own, and just kind of living it into the future. So I'm really happy to hear that. Thank you.
No, thank you. I'm grateful, and thank you for chatting with me. I know that we're just about out of time. I really, really appreciate. I hope we can talk again in the future if you're open to it.
Absolutely, you bet.
Okay, great. All right, everyone. We'll see you all next time on the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I hope you found this podcast informative. But if you would like more information on cryptocurrency, I found that a subscription to a service called 3 Commas has been very helpful for myself, giving me a little bit more confidence as I dip my toe into this new field. I've posted a link below the link about our new project in the description below, so feel free to check it out. I found it helpful. I hope you do as well. Thanks again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.